I've been a global macro investor for over 50 years. And one of the things I learned is that some of the things that surprised me with the most were things that never happened in my lifetime, but happened many times before. I learned that in 1971 when I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And the United States, on August 15th, President Nixon got on the television and he told the rest of the world that the gold that the dollars are supposed to be converted into, you won't get. And there was a devaluation. I worked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and I thought it was going to go down a lot, and it went up a lot. And I found the same thing happened on March 1933 with Roosevelt doing the same thing. And that taught me history repeats, but not necessarily in our lifetime. So three things are happening in our lifetimes that never happened before. And I saw that a few years ago, and I started to need to do that study. And those three things are the amount of creation of debt and the printing of money to monetize that debt, which is having its effects on inflation, on the value of money, on many things. The second is the amount of internal conflict that we're having. The conflict over wealth and values, the great polarity that has gotten to the point of having irreconcilable differences and threatening our system. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power and the existing world order. In other words, the rise of China. 1945, we created the existing world order that we're in, and that is being challenged. So that's what prompted me to study those things. And in order to do that, I had to study the last 500 years of history because these are big cycles. Thinking about the rise and decline of a reserve currency and its empires is a big cycle, and it was eye-opening. But I want to emphasize that the big cycle, it helped me understand what's going on right now with the Ukraine war, with the elections that are going to come up, with the economy, and so on. So that's why I did it. I would not have been able to anticipate the 2008 financial crisis if I didn't study the Great Depression. So this is true. And this is one of the curses of our existence, is that we haven't been through wars before. Our generation has not had experiences before, right? Things that happen regularly. So experiences and painful experiences have taught me that I needed it. We're going into an environment with this large creation of debt and printing of money, which is very much like going from the 1960s to the 1970s. You know, what happens is people get used to an environment. There's a paradigm, and a paradigm is sort of a mindset. And so if you look at it, they often last about a decade. The 70s was an inflationary decade. The 80s was a disinflationary decade. And they start off with surprises because the decades are more opposite than similar to the prior decades. So, for example, we're coming into the mechanics of you create a lot of money and debt, and it's going to devalue it, and it's going to produce inflation. But there's not an inflation understanding. So there's a mentality, for example, that people think, well, what's safe is to keep my money in cash because it doesn't go up and down and it's safe. And they haven't yet learned that it's not safe because you lose buying power. And so if the inflation rate is 7% and you have a zero return, you just lost 7% buying power. So by helping people to understand those things, how the environments have changed and the cause-effect relationships and where we are in the middle of it has been very helpful. What makes a country healthy and successful? One of the things I did was use measurements so that you can measure these things. And there's a cycle, and the cycle starts off with the basics. Usually there's an order. An order means a new system that comes into place. 1945, there's a war. The winners of the war get to determine the rules. That war can be an external war, it could be a civil war, but then the new power comes in and there's a new system, new rulers. And the basics start off with good quality civility with each other. Education. Education is a leading indicator of everything. If you put education and civility and working together and not having the conflicts, that period usually after the war is a period of peace and prosperity also, because there's a dominant power. Nobody wants to fight the dominant power. And it's also, wars are great leveling devices. They reduce wealth gaps. They wipe out debts and so on. And so there's a cycle of that kind of improvement. But naturally, as things improve and living standards arise, wealth gaps widen and also debts increase. And it's quite true for countries that have reserve currencies because they're allowed to borrow from the rest of the world because the rest of the world wants to save in that currency. And so quite often that cycle produces a lot more debt and larger wealth gaps. It also produces great inventiveness, but it also enters a new generation who haven't been through war, who might become maybe a little bit more decadent and not invest in infrastructure and education and the fundamentals that make things healthy. And as a result, you get larger wealth gaps and you get angry and you have more debt. And so a classic set of ingredients is that level of indebtedness and then losing the fundamentals. And of course, what happens is other competitors rise. So other countries after the war, Germany, Japan, they recover, China and other countries recover, and they become viable competitors in that. And so the power of that one dominant power ceases to be as dominant, and then there become more conflicts. So there are fundamentals. The fundamentals are basically, are you earning more than you're spending? Are you well educated and civil with each other? Are you productive? Are you competitive in the world? And so you can go from country to country right now and almost assess that. Those countries which are earning more than they're spending, that people are civil with each other and there's not internal order, and there's not a risk of an external conflict, are the ones that are best off. The Ukrainian situation is part of a greater story, which is the world being bifurcated and not dominated by a single power. And you can see how it's lining up. You can see which countries, by their actions, are lining up which ways in this conflict. The United States, the NATO countries, as it pertains to the Ukraine, but not as it would pertain to Asia. And you could see China, Russia, and you could see actions by India and so on, who is acting in what ways. And you will see that lineup be carried through in terms of things like, will there be a G20 meeting? And who will be on what side of the issues pertaining to that? So you're seeing this world polarity begin to line up, and you're seeing questions we'll see. This is like a test war. Many cases, and most cases in war, there's not a good understanding of how the actual war would take place. So it's very interesting when there is an actual war to take place to learn things, such as learning what the military power is and the possibility of escalating that war by Russia if Putin loses that war. Do they go to other escalated forms of conflict, such as nuclear? And also, it's a test of American sanctions. The greatest weapon the United States has, the only really unique weapon anymore, is the power of its economic sanctions. So the world is getting to see, will those sanctions work? Will they change the outcome? For example, what will be the economic consequences to Russia of those? Will that be a 10 or 12% decrease in GDP, which would mean not a very tolerable set of circumstances? And so we're learning three things I think we're learning at the moment. First, will Putin and Russia win this war? And I'll define win the war as being able to have control of the southeastern part of the Ukraine and gain territory. Number two, the impact on Russia is less than intolerable. In other words, it's tolerable. Number three, that he remains in power. If those things exist, then he would have a win. In other words, the cost of it would have been worth it. So there's that question. The second question is, what will this mean for sanctions, the power of sanctions, and also the cost of sanctions? Because we have a cost in the form of holders of dollar-denominated assets in many countries are now nervous that they could be sanctioned. You know, will the Chinese, will the Indians, will the Middle Easterns, who might be sanctions? And that's having an effect on capital flows. So what we'll learn, what will that effect be? And then we will learn of how the sides line up. And that is really a lot of learning for what the next episode is going to look like. It's so interesting. If you were to watch these things happen, World War II, you'd see almost identical. In other words, you would see that Japan was sanctioned, a series of sanctions. The oil was embargoed, the assets were frozen, and they were trapped, in a sense, economically. And then they responded with Pearl Harbor. And you could see always economic warfare, intense like that, cut them off, is something that happens before there's a military conflict. It's almost like it reads the same. It's true that over time, the world has become more interconnected. It's interesting with the First World War. I mean, think about it. If you go back a few hundred years, it took a day. In a day, you could travel 25 miles. Today, in a day, you can be on the other side of the world. There's instant communications. So the First World War was the First World War. And the Second World War brought us more together, and it was the Second World War. And so then we are all connected, and that brings us in that position. History has shown, interestingly, that connections did not minimize the chances of war. In fact, for example, in World War I, in order to minimize the chances of wars, which was then run by royalties, they intermarried. And there was nothing closer than to be intermarried, and yet they went into World War I and so on. So I think the connectivity, and it also brings up other issues like literally cyber connectivity and so on, and it creates a dynamic. It means that there are less safe places in this world war. So it makes it, I think, very important that we don't get into a war. Today, how we are with each other is scaringly different. And it's measured in the statistics and the charts that are shown in my book. There is the greatest political polarity since 1900. And there's a real question of whether in the next election, either side will accept losing. There is a question about the acceptance of the rules. There is a moving to different states, not just for tax reasons, but for values differences, great differences. And there's much more fighting between the rich and the poor. And there are greater differences. It becomes always more and more intense until there is a war. We are in the early stages of a type of civil war. That's what goes on. And of course, once you cross a line, then there's a fight. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. And that's what we have.